Hey everybody, welcome to the Chopping Block. Every couple of weeks, the four of us get together and give the industry insider's perspective on the crypto topics of the day. So quick intros. First, we got Tom, the DeFi maven and master of memes. Next up, we've got Robert, crypto connoisseur and captain of Compound. Next, we have Tarun, the Giga Brain and Grand Poobah at Gauntlet. And then we have Haseeb, myself, the head hype man at Dragonfly. Of course, we today have a special guest joining us, the great and illustrious Andre Cronje, who is coming out of his early retirement to grace us with his presence and give us his perspectives. Hey, Andre, good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. I think nowadays it's more scam Dre or rug Dre or rug villain, or I hear those more often than anything positive. So when you do the little label for the show, maybe crypto villain, maybe that's a good one to go for.
I'd be okay with crypto villain. Scam Dre is an interesting attempt at a nickname. I haven't heard that, but yeah, crypto Twitter can be a bit like recess. You know, it's a little brutal. But real quick before I start off the show, just want to say all four of us, I guess maybe the five of us in some sense, are early stage investors in crypto. But I want to caveat nothing we say here is investment advice or legal advice or even life advice. So Andre, how's retirement? Are you retired?
It isn't. So retirement. Not that fortunate or lucky yet. At this point in time, it's just a different vertical. DeFi just wasn't for me anymore. That's really the only shift. It's an industry that I think is still going to do well, and I think it is still going to evolve well. I think being an doxxed individual, there's just more and more and more risk to participate in traditional DeFi systems. And for that reason, originally, the plan was to go completely back to traditional finance, where I had originally started from. After about doing that for 2 to 3 months, I realized that I'm also being a little bit of an idiot because I'm neglecting a lot of knowledge that I've built up being in this space. So move that to, what I've now recently started calling regulated crypto, which in itself is also a little bit of a misnomer because, it's more crypto translation. I don't think there's an appropriate terminology for it currently, but there's this intersection between blockchain language, and this is language we speak and know. You go buy an ERC20 on an AMM, and then you hold that for speculative value, or you go deposit that and then borrow against it in a decentralized lender. And you keep that in a non-custodial wallet where you do custodianship of your private keys. And this is stuff and I'm pretty sure everyone on this podcast really takes for granted, the amount of knowledge that, we just innately have because we do this stuff on a daily basis. And then, when you go talk outside to traditional finance, who the people are excited about these products, they want to get involved. They want to start leveraging it, but it's not a language they speak. So a big focus for me now is just the translation of that language. So, it's not an ERC20 or a native token. It's a crypto one-to-one ETF. It's not a custodial solution. It's a PCI DSS compliant custody solution. It's literally taking that knowledge and then packaging it in a framework or language that the rest of the world understands. No, I think retirement is still very far away. I actually don't think retirement is ever on the books. I think I'll just keep working till my brain dies and then be happy.
That tends to happen pretty fast in crypto. If you stick around long enough, your brain turns into mush. It's a very noble task to try to work in that translation layer between TradFi and crypto. But it is also a little bit surprising because you are, to many people in crypto, you're like the king of the degens. And I think actually Robert on a previous show, I believe he made some comment about how the way in which you kind of walked out on your DeFi empire, I think rubbed many people the wrong way.
Yeah, if I remember, his words were a epic rug pull.
An epic rug pull.
If I remember the show correctly.
So you're a listener then.
Yeah. No, I like to stay in touch. Look, there's basically 2 podcasts I follow. It's this one and All In.
Amazing.
And that's really the only 2 I really listen to. I don't really think there are a lot others that are consistent, bring news on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis. So yeah, no, big fan, big follower. Robert, if you'll allow me, I would like to use you as a counterparty to a theoretical experiment, if I may.
I'm all in.
Awesome. Okay. So 2 things. One, who here on this podcast know that I built Phantom?
I do. I think we all do.
Yeah,
no?
yeah. We're familiar with your experience with Phantom.
Okay. But so I'm curious because a big part of that statement, and that kind of leads into the next part I want to get into, was that Phantom was a active investor play on my behalf. And I'd like to unpack that. And the reason I'd actually like to unpack that is specifically there's a lot of rumors that have caused me some reputational damage in terms of like how I left this industry. That like there's a statement of I made I think $1 billion and then used that to exit because now I'd made my cash and I left. So 2 parts that is important to me there is part number 1 is the sort of how do you fight that? And now the reason for fighting it isn't, like I don't consider it an insult. That's awesome. Like respect to anyone that's capable of pulling that off. But at the same time, like there's legal, there's financial, there's a bunch of risks that occur if the public perception is that. And so I wanted, if I can, to actually use this as an opportunity to address that as well. Because, number 1, the only evidence I've seen towards that was based on a Rect article that I think was like redacted and, not redacted, what's the word?
Retracted?
Retracted. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Where they retracted that, and there was a wallet that for a long time was thought linked to me, that the foundation came out and said, look, this is their stuff. I've given them a lot of guidance on what they should do there and where they should go and where they should deploy funds, being innately in the industry. But, they've publicly admitted it's theirs. So like that's sort of the number 1. And then number 2 is the thought experiment around how that happened, right? Because like Yearn Wi-Fi tokens, I didn't keep any for myself. Like that was all given away. I farmed some, I'll admit. But let's say, there was, I've had 3 opportunities basically, 4 opportunities really to make money in this industry. Opportunity number 1 would have been if I took some kind of allocation in Phantom. Never had any of that stuff in my wallets, never took any allocation and wasn't part of that. Foundation will vouch for that as well, but that's a more difficult one to prove because, that's all over the place. Yearn, opportunity number 2, where, I could have had tokens for myself. I gave everything away. I could have yield farm. I could have yield farm a lot, and that potentially could have been part of it. So let's say I was the biggest yield farmer, bar none, and managed to yield farm, I don't know, like what was it at its peak? I think at its peak at 40K, it was probably around $2 billion, $3 billion max TVL. So in that case, like the distribution from day one, like top farmers had a max amount there of less than 10%. So even assuming I was a top farmer, let's go through the thought experiment to see it's 100 mil, which I don't have close to, but let's go through it. Then number 2 opportunity was Keeper. Again, everything was released in the pool, but I could have been an early buyer. I could have bought up a lot as soon as I released it myself by other wallets, theoretically speaking. Its max cap at its highest point was $500 million, so like not really a lot of opportunities there. But let's say I bought, again, 20% of the supply, so it gives me another 100, which again, not true, but still, thought experiment. Last opportunity was Solidly, which I didn't even participate. Like since I launched it, it was meant to be a completely hands-off immutable primitive. I did not participate in any of that stuff. So what I'm curious about, right, is like on this podcast, there was talk about me doing active investing and having grown this funds and then being able to escape it. And I think that's a large part of a lot of people's disdain for me, if I can use that word, is, this idea that I made a lot of money and then was like, okay, well, screw everyone else. I'm now going to take my toys and go home. And like, I've been looking for a way how to challenge this because, it's one of those things where it's almost impossible to prove a negative, but I feel like both from a theoretical experiment side, it's disproved, and from a, things that people thought were connected to me that other entities have come out and said are connected to them are also proven on that side. So, I'm open to other suggestions, but I'm also keen on hearing any challenges to that.
Robert?
I don't have any, by the way, I don't follow addresses or do the accounting. I'm just, seeing what's on, public channels and public discussion forums. So I don't have any special insight here. one of the things that I think is generally accepted is that you are, and this is a good thing, you are the driving force behind the adoption of Phantom. Like, this is kudos, right? Without you, Phantom, I think in a lot of sense would have a tiny fraction of the user adoption that it has today, or that it had today, right? And so I think there's an extremely widespread understanding that you are the pretty much the sole driver of all of the value in that ecosystem for a while. And I think there's an assumption that in accordance with that, you also had a large exposure to the projects and activities on Phantom. Now that's an assumption, and I think other people on the internet have done work to look at addresses and things like that, which I have not done. But there is a widespread understanding that you are the creator of most of the activity there, and that's a good thing, right? That's in some sense a fact. And then there's an assumption that follows, and whether that's right or wrong, the first part I think is certainly true, that you are the man behind the ecosystem there in a good way, right? Wouldn't exist without you, and that many people assume that as that occurred, that you had exposure to that ecosystem.
The first answer obviously is that nobody on the show knows, because we don't sit around trying to figure out who owns what, because we have other stuff to do in our lives than to try to speculate on other people's wealth. But the story I'm hearing from you, Andre, is that nope, I'm not a billionaire. I didn't make a ton of money from all these things that are quote unquote rug pulls. Obviously, you made some money, because it's pretty hard to have been in crypto during DeFi summer and not have made a lot of money. But the assumption I think that many people make about you doesn't sound like it's a fair one or a correct one. That being said, I mean, one thing that I would like to understand is, what is it that drives you to, I mean, okay, I can understand why you would rage quit in crypto, because crypto sucks. Like, crypto's.
I understand that too. I have a lot of sympathy with a lot of what you say and feel on this topic.
What is it that continues to drive you in wanting to continue to build now, if not in DeFi and not in Web3, in the sort of connective layer between the real world and the crypto world?
Yeah, a mate of mine actually recently asked me this, and I didn't have an answer for him. It took me like 2 to 3 days actually trying to like think through that and like trying to get to a conclusion. And honestly, the conclusion, unfortunately, is I don't know what else I would be doing if I wasn't doing this. I wish it was more than that. Like I wish there was some greater, bigger thing happening, but it's just like
the love of the game.
And it's everything I'm doing today is still going to happen. It might just happen a little bit faster if I nudge it along. But like it's looking at it, it's an inevitable puzzle. It's pieces that have to come together for things to make logically sense. But yeah, like the main reason is I don't know what else. But there's also just a part that it's just really cool. Like the stuff is really fun. It's really exciting. And like a big driver for me is also learning as well. So, a big reason why I originally got into blockchain is because I didn't understand it. And a big reason why I'm sort of enjoying the intersection I'm at now is because it's, again, a bunch of new stuff that I don't understand and I get to learn from there. I mean, previously, my previous fintech experience, that was heavily in the payday loans area. So, that's not really a wow area, and it's also a very basic business. So like now, all of a sudden, playing with, like I'm learning of ETFs, I'm learning about bonds, I'm learning about a bunch of instruments that I sort of knew existed, but I didn't have any intricacy knowledge on there. And so like that's also awesome to be learning all of those kinds of things. And like it's also an opportunity just to speak to a lot of entities I otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to.
Totally.
But yeah, it's you wake up in the morning and it's the thing you want to do. Like,
yeah.
I'm curious to hear more on your thesis on sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a regulated DeFi or a RegFi or something like that, because I think this has been something that people have wanted to see or tried in crypto for a very long time. We had like the security token thing, we've had like KYC'd DeFi, and nothing has really stuck, nothing's really gotten traction. But I feel like obviously there's this tension where it's like both sort of sides want something to work here. How do you sort of think about Like, what is the product? What is sort of the approach that you think is going to succeed where these other things haven't really taken off?
So the approach isn't that different. I think the language has changed a little bit, but so first things first on the approach, right? Like this is the same conversations that we've been having since 2017, since about I really got into the space. The difference is, and I've told this story a lot of times, the difference is in 2017, we'd send an email and we wouldn't even get a response. In 2018, we'd get a response, but it'll be a cursory, okay, we'll see. 2019, all of a sudden, they would send the email, but that's really only to kind of ask questions. 2020, all of a sudden, you'd get a meeting and you'd actually be talking to the people. Now, 2022, where we're at, like these teams have budgets and things where they're actively exploring it. But like, if you get to the decision makers, 51% of them are interested, 49 still aren't sold on it. So the thing is, it's progressively been changing over the years. But now the other thing I've also realized is in my conversations with these same entities a year ago, 2 years ago, I was never trying to speak their language. I was drinking the Kool-Aid 100%, and I was expecting them to, they're going to come buy ETH and Phantom and whatever and use that for gas fees, and they're going to install their own wallets and use that stuff. And like, I wasn't trying to help bridge their language and understanding. So where we're at now, we're at a point where these guys are interested, they want to engage, but they have two barriers. Barrier number one is solvable. That's a technological barrier. Barrier number two is a regulatory barrier. But now the approach is, let's solve the technological barrier. Let's help them with custody solutions to understand. Let's help them with funds, ETFs, whatever it is, language that they are used to, and then use them to help push on the regulatory side.
Can I ask one quick question? How do you feel about the Yuga Labs Otherside thing, given that was KYC DeFi? If we in some ways it was like the epitome of that, and yet it kind of was horrible in a lot of ways, and yet good in other ways. Right?
Before we jump into that question, let me hold that for a second and basically tell the story, because I think this is probably one of the biggest news items of the week. So jumping straight into it. So Yuga Labs, which is the company behind the Bored Ape Yacht Club empire, they raised money. They basically did a land sale for Otherside, which is their upcoming metaverse project. So they sold 55,000 plots of land, and they raked in $317 million in proceeds from selling these plots of land, which caused enormous amounts of congestion on Ethereum. So the largest congestion we've ever seen in Ethereum history. Gas fees shot up to 8,000 Gwei, and there were huge amounts of gas wars that were going on in the mempool, trying to compete for winning these land parcels. And there was over 172 million in fees that were spent in trying to compete to get access to these Otherside land plots. And apparently it crashed Etherscan. That's how bad the incredible amount of congestion was. So there's Yuga Labs in the aftermath of this insane land sale. Yuga Labs declared that they apologized for breaking Ethereum and that they were going to explore launching their own chain, which people are now speculating is going to be called Ape Chain. Very unclear what exactly that means, but it pretends to be some kind of Axie Infinity style sidechain or something like that is presumably what they're exploring.
One thing to point out is that they had this pre-registration KYC process, and then there was this whole secondary market for KYC addresses, and they basically that caused a lot of like weird behavior prior to the sale. And so I guess the reason I bring up this question is the fact that this like whole KYC thing kind of inevitably caused this extra stampede into this ecosystem where there was just like a restricted number of KYC addresses. Those things got sold. The people who bought those were just more aggressive and didn't know how to use a blockchain. Like, how do you feel about that, Andre, as like the future of crypto?
Personally speaking, there will probably be some kind of a mix, and I think that lies in the mix. But I think people should choose which side of the fence they're on. Like you're either fully on chain, and then you need to abide by those rules. And I wrote this in the one thing. It's like maritime law. Like if you want to be a pirate, you can be a pirate. But there are rules to be a pirate. Like it might not be written down, it might not be enforced, but there are still rules that are respected. And like, it's honor among thieves. And like what a lot of these things do. So Otherside KYC to me is like STOs. Why did STOs not become sticky, right? And like a big reason there is if you went through all the energy and you went through all the tape and you got all of your forms and you eventually got your Reg A, Reg D, whatever the hell it is, why the hell are you going to launch a token? You can go onto the New York Stock Exchange or whatever. There's a lot more liquidity. There's a lot more brokers. There's a lot more funds that are going to have access to you eventually. Like if you get big enough, NASDAQ, S&P, whatever will, dump into you as well. But if you're a token on chain and you've already gone through all of that effort, why the hell are you doing that? That's sort of, hey, we heard this KYC thing, so now we're going to add this KYC thing. We don't really know why we need the KYC thing, but just in case we're going to add this KYC thing. So like that's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where like you're adding mechanisms not for some specific necessity. Why did they add KYC? Under what?
I actually disagree with this, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately about the role of KYC in DeFi and in on-chain mechanisms. So the story usually is that KYC is about compliance. KYC is in order to follow the laws and enforce OFAC restrictions, and usually it's about obeying some particular regulator or some set of financial services requirements. And of course that's important, and there are some applications that are going to do that. But I think for the most part, what makes DeFi is that it's global, is that it's not under the jurisdiction of any single regulator, and that you sort of push the compliance requirements onto the individual, not onto the platform itself. Right? That's the whole idea of crypto, is that as an individual, you can interact with crypto in a compliant way, but crypto itself does not need to be compliant. Crypto is just crypto. In the same way that the internet, is not compliant. The internet doesn't follow, a particular set of rules. Like, the internet doesn't follow GDPR, but individual people on the internet can decide to follow GDPR, which allows you to have it be this bazaar where people can take their own view. I think the thing that KYC is going to change within crypto is not compliance, but rather marketing. And by that, what I mean is that the biggest problem in crypto is quote unquote identity, and by identity, what we mean is we don't know who is retail. We don't know who is community. We don't know who is a customer. All we know is an address. And there are a bunch of janky ways we can try to figure out who real people are by saying, okay, did you participate in governance? Have you been around for this long? Have you touched these many DeFi apps? And so there's a lot of stuff on chain of like this, KYF or know your farmer type things that people started to put into place to identify the difference between real users and just people farming airdrops or people faking addresses. But every protocol on DeFi or every protocol, whether it's NFTs or whatever, they want to identify who are real people. Because if you are a real person, you are a member of my community. You are, especially if you're retail, right? If you're a retail user and you're not just like another address of Alameda, it's very, very important that if I'm liquidity mining, if I'm giving out incentives, if I'm doing airdrops, that I want to make sure it's going to real human beings. And I suspect that in the future, this is going to be the primary thing that KYC gets used for on chain, is that it's not that you have to KYC in order to use this protocol, but rather that you have to KYC if you want to get a reward. And this reward is, one person, one reward. And that's going to be the rule. And the only way to enforce that, we've had like CAPTCHAs and stuff that people have used in the past, which is of course extremely gameable. I used to work in anti-fraud, and I can tell you it is very, very cheap to hire, not only can this stuff be neural netted, out of existence, but also it's very, very cheap to hire people in the third world to just do CAPTCHAs for you at scale. It costs, like a penny. So it is the only real way that we know to disaggregate who are real people is with KYC, which is why it's done in every single centralized crypto platform in order to figure out who's a real user.
Counterpoint. Let's look at Otherside just a few days ago, okay? They used KYC to conduct this land sale. I know people who bought like 50 KYC'd addresses and bragged about it on Twitter, right? Like, this was not a successful mapping of one individual, one right. It was an absolute fail in some cases. There's photos of people in Chinese internet cafes with like walls of browsers pulled up, right?
Yeah, to be clear, you can also do that on Binance, right? You could also do that on...
Absolutely. But there's like extremely clear evidence that at least just the hugest example of this 2 days ago was an absolute fail for trying to enforce one person, one address, right? Like,
no doubt. Look, I completely agree with that, right? Whenever you're thinking about anything that gives you civil resistance, it's a question of what is the cost of breaking the civil resistance, right? Like a passport is the hardest thing. It's the most expensive thing that you can use to fake a person. Now, it's not foolproof, right? It's not the, like there is some cost to any claim of I am a human being by just getting another human being to do it for you. You're not going to get around that with any platform, whether it's a Web 2 company or a Web 3 company. But I think KYC is like the gold standard of the best you can do.
I disagree. So, I mean, just taking your example of a passport is the best way of doing this. Each passport, right, could have a public address associated with it, and like the private key or the seed is somehow mapped to the user. Like, you know.
Well, but to the extent that you're selling addresses, right? You could sell the address that's in your passport.
Yeah, of course. And then you'd be shit out of luck if that's the global standard of everything, and then you can never be a person again or whatever. Like,
well, of course. Well, there are a lot of people who will never be a part. You know, if you're living in some village in India and you're like, hey, I have no use for this. Like, here you go. That's what people do today. People sell passports.
Andre, I actually wonder if, like, does this mean that your future is really working on identity? I think there's some people in the YouTube chat who are like, is that kind of like what you're implying? Like your future kind of, the stuff you're most interested in working on is not just like, hey, fintech, TradFi bridging between crypto, but actually really this identity problem? Or are you actually really focused on this bridging aspect? Because at some level, this identity thing seems more fundamental than kind of the, like, how do you get NASDAQ to care?
So to me, there's two conversations, but they're both solved by the same tool. So allow me to qualify. Know your customer, definitely, as Haseeb just described, makes sense because you want to, as you originally put it, it's from a marketing angle. You eventually want to know, who should I be talking to? How to identify them? Am I talking to them correctly? Et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole field of science. A separate KYC from a compliance perspective is, what jurisdiction is this person in? What rules do they fall under? How do they need to be treated in that given circumstance? And I do think those are two separate topics, even though they use the same tool. So that being said, this first part that I'm doing with a lot of commercial banks and central banks and traditional institutions is not identity focused, because they already have this information. So they already have access, they have the pipelines, they have the processes in place. It is not about trying to solve that on-chain yet. The reason I add that qualification is because, now you have to take a few further hops, and obviously the further we go into the future, the more unlikely. But let's fast forward 5 years. Probably being too optimistic, but let's fast forward 5 years. And a lot of what transacting is happening on chain. These are commercial banks who are issuing commodities, derivatives, these kinds of things on chain. They're trading, they're investing, they're depositing money into Compound, they're lending from there. Like this is a forward-looking possibility. But now, once you start having that kind of amount of data, because at that point you have a lot of payment data, you have settlement data, and you have sort of probably at least some kind of on-chain indicator of KYC data. You'll probably not have the data, but you'll at least have a commercial bank A recognizes this address as belonging to this person. So that already means you can start looking more into, okay, is reoccurring payments. This is probably a debit order these people are doing, stuff like that. But now with that amount of data, all of a sudden, you can start working towards, why are fraud and bank systems kind of shit as they are currently? It's because they're not sharing data. They're not really doing mass scale analytics or predictions or AI or any of this kind of stuff on this. And when I say AI,
well, they are usually doing it by outsourcing. That's like sort of the problem, right? Is like effectively they have to use like the Palantirs of the world to like communicate across banks to be like, oh, like we can identify this user, right? That is sort of like, I agree there's no standard for communication and sort of data formatting. But do you think like a blockchain is the ideal way of doing that? That's like sort of sort of it's not totally clear that it is sort of the optimum way to do that type of sharing.
Now again, there's a difference between blockchain technology, which doesn't necessarily mean a public blockchain. Blockchain technology, even in a consortium sense, is definitely a better way to transmit data than, closed loop currently. Because if nothing else, and even if it's privatized, there's more things you can do that. And Numerai is a great example, where all of their data is privatized, and they still allow that as public data sets for people to play with and build stuff on and experiment with. And like there's, even though they're a little bit more closed source than my personal liking, there's still more fundamental discovery that can happen there than in a completely closed loop system. So eventually, I hope that a lot of this is in public open data sets, because we've also seen a lot of breakthroughs. OpenAI is a great example, right? If we want to go down that area, because that's open shared data sets. That's, hey, your stuff, everyone please work on it, versus
no,
hey,
I think it's not though. That's the core criticism
of
OpenAI.
Yeah, it's definitely not an open data set, right? It's not even open API access, right? Like I can't even go use GPT-3 without or the future large language models.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, you can't join the group. You can't join the subscription. Like I'm on most of those.
That's true. You can sign up for the SaaS service, which is better than nothing, but it's not exactly open in the way that we think about opening crypto.
No, fair. It's not where we want to get to, but you get more discovery when you allow more people to work on it. That's kind of the baseline, I think.
Right.
Sorry, complete tangent, but I've been playing a lot with that. I don't know how to pronounce it. The Dalle 2, Dalle 2, Dalle 2.
Dalle 2, yeah.
That when they open that up for NFT, when that's public access, I think NFT PFP projects are definitely going to become a lot more prolific.
That is for sure. It's a big question what something like Dalle 2 is going to do to the consumption and generation of art. So Dalle 2, for those who don't know, this is not crypto, but it's still fascinating. Dalle 2 is a machine learning model that basically from a text description can generate an image, and it can also edit images purely again from a text description. So it can also use whatever. There's a lot of stuff. I'm obviously not an expert on any of this, so I'm going to butcher the explanation. But TLDR, AI and image generation is getting absolutely crazy. And Dalle 2 can create some amazing... There was actually a Twitter thread that somebody from OpenAI posted of basically taking other people's Twitter descriptions and generating an image out of it. And the images were absolutely incredible. And I was like, okay, whenever this thing is open, I definitely want to do that for my own Twitter profile image from now on. It's only AI-generated profile pictures.
So you can do it for your new NFT collection. You're going to put a bunch of Fiverr contractors out of business.
Yeah, that's true. Dalle 2 is really bad for Fiverr. Anyway, rewinding a bit to the actual Yuga Labs Otherside land sale. How does everyone feel about the land sale? Right? It was totally crazy. It took down, basically took down Ethereum. A lot of people are pissed. People are claiming all sorts of conspiracy theories that they did it on purpose to try to get a pretense to launch their own chain. Governance within ApeCoin has been kind of a shit show. How do people feel about the Otherside land sale?
I think Robert's the only real ape here who actually participated in the land sale.
I was going to say, given Robert's last opinion on the value of ape and everything, I think definitely he should set the precedence.
I'm probably the one who's the most in the Bored Ape and Yuga ecosystem, as well as the CryptoPunk ecosystem. I guess I'll take the mantle of NFT guy here. I mean, obviously, I think as a community member, the land sale was kind of a mess. I think a lot of the narrative of the Yuga ecosystem, the reason why it's worked so well is that a year ago, like 1 year and a few days ago, if you minted a Bored Ape for 0.08 ETH, today, or as of a week ago, you would have had probably over $1 million of assets, because one Bored Ape turned into mutants, turned into dogs, turned into ApeCoin, turned into all these things. And it's been probably the most successful investment for a retail investor of all time, period, full stop. Like in any asset, it's like buying Bitcoin in 2010, right? In a lot of ways, like $200 turned into $1 million, which is why their community is so ravenous and like so, ride or die will speak volumes about them forever, right? Highest ROI of any asset in crypto. The only thing comparable is Bitcoin 2010, right? So with that being the context of it, I mean, the narrative for why it works is because it's made a lot of regular people extremely rich. CryptoPunks were inaccessible even a year ago to people. Bored Apes were $250, right? That's where the strength comes from. And in a lot of ways, I think this might be the turning point of that, in that this hasn't made a lot of people really rich. In fact, it's started to be the first event in the Yuga timeline that's been the opposite. And by the way, Otherside is more than just Yuga. It's Yuga and Animoca brands and all of these other things. But at this point, I think the ratio of them creating value to taking value has finally flipped for the first time. And I think that's what's most
I mean, the license is kind of incredible, right? Like, we should actually describe what the license basically says you own nothing.
Yeah,
literally nothing.
Okay,
you
fine.
own
Like, there's so much.
It's like owning a
so the
UTXO
licensing, the reason why Bored Apes
even
even won in the first place, yes, is because they said you own the art, right? You have commercial rights to the art as well. Go have fun. These are your assets. Go own them. Unlike CryptoPunks, which said Larva Labs owns all the IP. Screw you. You don't own anything. You can't even use the image externally. Like, you have a pointer on a smart contract on a blockchain. That's it. And so even like the assets around this land sale, the IP is not the same. It's becoming more restrictive, not less. And I think there have been statements potentially by them that they are looking to change this. But as it's currently written, the contracting around what you get is terrible in comparison to previous Bored Ape ecosystem engagement. So in a lot of ways, I think the failure of this is that they took in a huge amount of value, and the participants in this are barely break even. And in a lot of cases have lost a lot of value. There's people who bought Bored Apes for 160 ETH, which was like the floor basically right before this event, to get land which is worth 10 ETH, and now the floor is 115, And so in a lot of ways, this event was the first destruction of value in the ecosystem. And so that's where I see it as being a failure. A lot of other things are failures. Like, there's a lot of criticism that they went with an intentionally inefficient distribution mechanism, which the rules changed frequently in the hours leading up to it to create confusion and inefficiencies and all of these things that led to the blockchain having a gas price of about 6,000 GWay for hours, which for all of us that were experiencing this is crazy. I mean, I tweeted like, hey, Black Thursday 2020 was 200 GWay, and we all thought that was off the charts insanity at the time. Like, now you can have a completely normal Saturday where crypto's not down by 40% and the blockchain's at 6,000 GWay for hours, right? And because they had inefficient contracts in Solidity as well. There's been criticism there. So I think all around it's been disappointing. I think a lot of people were hoping that this would be the next, increasingly successful event. And it hasn't been. Where will this go? I don't know. It could be a wild success, right? But
so, I mean, the big question though, Robert, is how many KYC'd addresses did you buy before the
zero?
Sale?
So 0. I was like critical of people buying KYC'd address because I played by the rules. I had one address. I
see.
did my thing. But
Robert, you're so virtuous. That's why we love you.
Yeah, Andre, what would you have done if you were buying land? What would have been your strategy?
Well, I don't think the KYC addresses was the right approach necessarily. So, because it was so easily Sybil attacked, like we've seen in every project that tries to go with like a Sybil based approach, it's easily attacked. This one was attacked as well. Like, I know people who bought KYC'd addresses and they were like, by the way, when you buy a KYC'd address, someone already has the private key. So like these people were like trusting someone not to completely screw them over.
To be fair, this is the entire ecosystem of people who are morons who post their seed phrase. Like, Bored Apes are people who are proud of being moronically stupid idiots. Like, it truly is. It is obscene that like their entire ecosystem, the value creation, has generally been taking advantage of a lack of wherewithal. And that in itself should be insulting to society. But this goes back to
the strength of it, which is you had regular people who invested like $200, which are now millionaires, right? And these are regular people. These were not the most crypto savvy. These are not people, who have been like crypto OGs, like the reason why this is a problem is that a huge portion of the community was able to access it without really any capital at all. And that was magic.
Yeah, look, I agree with Robert on this. I think the fact that it's really easy to lose your apes is not an indictment of apes holders, but rather of crypto itself. That like we don't have better and easier best practices and defaults that make it hard for you to do that.
Yeah, and by the way, like the amount of like sophisticated attacks, not just on like regular people, but on institutions, on sophisticated people. I've been scammed in crypto. Like I'll admit that. Like, I know a lot of extremely sophisticated people who have in some sense lost money somewhere, somehow. Like this is a vicious ecosystem and it's not easy. And like, this is where I agree with Andre. Like, I do think the structure of accessing it will evolve over time because this is not set up for regular people. The fact that like you have like private key open systems is incredible because it means like you have like open APIs basically to build on top of. But like I truly don't think that in 20 years you're gonna have people managing their own private keys because it's so damn risky. Like there will be intermediary solutions. And the fact that you can is what will give it strength. But like I don't think people should be managing their own money in wallets that are constantly being attacked. Like the Lazarus group is now targeting people. Like that's crazy.
I do think institutionalizing stupidity is not exactly the place I would like hope a society evolves to, which is unfortunately I think what we've seen in a lot of NFT land is that.
Tarun, if I can ask you, do you think humanity is getting smarter or dumber from your experience over the last 10 years?
I think the tails of the distribution are driving far from the median and mean. The tails are evolving, and the median is shrinking. Right, we're just like getting this like high skew.
Maybe a point in Andre's column here is on the topic of the KYC and license for the other side. There's actually another term in the license, which is it's against the terms to transfer your other side land to a non-KYC'd address. So if anything, this is maybe the first successful implementation of KYC'd DeFi, where we have this nice little KYC'd ecosystem of people who can only interact with each other.
Wait, so that's not informed? It's not enforced at the contract level?
No.
So it's against the terms, which means what?
You sell out an OpenSea, you basically violate the terms.
What?
But will OpenSea enforce that, or no? They won't.
I don't think so.
Of course not. Of course not. Yeah, I mean that's crazy. Wait, so what actually? I mean, nothing. What can they do to you? Like, do they have the ability to just like snatch the land if you end up selling it to someone else who's not KYC'd?
Assuming theoretically they build some huge metaverse one day, then they could just not allow your asset in the game.
Sure, but that still allows it to circulate on secondary markets. Like, you could have a dealer in the middle who like takes it, can't use it in the game, but could go resell it to somebody else, right? Like that. I mean, that
what
seems
is
like
the value of
that
Bitcoin address that's on the OFAC list?
Yeah, it's similar. Sure. Where you have dirty and clean Bitcoin, you have dirty and clean other side.
But if it ends, again, it's a difference between dirty and clean. Like dirty, non-KYC should not mean dirty. Like OFAC list means dirty. Okay, like that's like okay. It's been in the hands of North Korea. It's
dirty in a video game is the same, right? It's like I just block you from ever use because the game is not on chain, so there's no way of if the game is on chain and you can't like actually have it be like the game engine be trustlessly executing, then it's just like at the end of the day you're still at the whim of the.
That is absolutely crazy.
Do we think there's going to be a game? I asked this to Andre. I asked this to all of us. Do we actually think a game is going to realistically ship within?
This is the game. You're playing it right now.
This is the game. Yeah. Correct. Tom is correct.
An MMORPG playable game.
Okay. And speaking of which, so there was a piece of news I saw on Twitter last night that I thought was very perfect timing. Is that Square Enix just sold a bunch of game franchises to like another game developer. It sold Tomb Raider, Deus Ex, and like a bunch of other franchises, and 1,100 game developers in one big bundle for guess how much? $300 million, which is less than what Otherside made in its NFT sales, which is absolutely nuts.
This is all of Square Enix's Western brand, so it's Just Cause, it's Uncharted, like it's a bunch of like really, really good titles.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So crypto, man. The other thing that's also striking, and I think we can end on this, is just the efficiency loss that Yuga Labs made because of their auction design, which is one of the first things that you feel like anyone in crypto would have told them is like, guys, don't do a gas war.
It's not that they even did that. They literally were just like, actually, Dutch auctions are dumb. We wrote the code.
I know. They were going to do a Dutch auction and they changed their mind. They lost $172 million. Half of their proceeds they lost to miners in gas wars because they changed their auction design.
They lost to ETH holders. Give EIP59 a lot of credit.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
We gotta give. Let's take the silver lining view of this.
Okay. Hey.
We proved that EIP 1559 worked not only really well in practice, it was able to provide an insane amount of rebates, like probably the highest discounted, set of rebates in history. Like no centralized entity has ever paid out $100 million in rebates to its users in 1 hour. So let's give that some credit. That should be in the Guinness Book of World Records.
Very, very well said, Tarun. Very well said. Always the ever the optimist in looking at these situations.
I think that's kind of cool, right? Like that's pretty.
No, it is. No, you're absolutely right. You're 100%. Amazing. Well, Yuga Labs, thanks for giving back in an unexpected way. The other interesting news of the week, and we're running low on time, so we'll just take this. So Solana, on the same day as the Yuga Labs Otherside NFT sales, Solana had a massive outage. So they were out for about 7 hours, which was almost as long as I think they had a previous outage that was like 17 hours. So this was not quite to that length, but it was basically most of the day Solana was down. And this outage was, like with Yuga Labs, was caused by NFT bots. So there's a contract called Candy Machine, which is basically the standard SPL, standard library contract for minting NFTs. And essentially you had, I think it was on the order of 4 million transactions per second or something like that, that were being bombarded. And of course, Solana doesn't have a mempool. It only has a single leader at any given time. And so the single leader is just getting absolutely jackhammered by millions of transactions per second of just all these bots trying to mint NFTs for super cheap, even before the NFT minting is available. And so that took down Solana. And as Solana was trying to turn back on, there was a bunch of controversy because one of the validators that was, so Solana has a certain number of validators. They were trying to coordinate in the Discord to try to figure out how to turn things back on. One of the Solana validators suggested, like, hey guys, in order to turn things back on, we gotta, we can't, the moment we turn the validators back on, they just get taken down again, right, by the swarm of NFT bot traffic. So here's an instruction you can use if you want to, no pressure, but here's an instruction you can use within your IP tables to block incoming traffic that is targeting the Candy Machine contract. And when people saw this, they were like, oh my God, censorship. And people were freaking out about what this meant for Solana and decentralization, blah, blah, blah. And so Solana is obviously back up and running. And the Candy Machine GitHub introduced a change that should now penalize people who are trying to mint before minting is actually available for that particular contract. But it's again been a struggle for Solana and everybody in the space to handle what's going on with NFT bots and NFT minting. So reflections on the Solana outage. I guess Andre, we'll start with you, given that you are the only one of us who's developed an L1. What's your take on the Solana outage this weekend?
I think it comes down to what would have happened if they had done nothing. Even in a decentralized blockchain that has a leader-based system that has one leader elected every 24 hours, theoretically, the next 24 hours, a new leader should have been elected and they should have gone up and it should have continued from there and then the next and the next and the next. So the fact that a remedial action had to be taken, it makes me ask how well will it perform in an adversarial environment? And, the answer is not that great. So and this is where nomenclature starts becoming fuzzy. Is it a distributed system? Is it a decentralized system? Is it really a blockchain solution? So, I think maybe it needs a different categorization because, it's not for what it does and for what it accomplishes. It's fine if it went down, because this is basically a very lengthy round robin server selection load balancer is what it comes down to. So there's
a 7-hour latency between leader election, is what you're saying.
That I would probably make less. I think that's maybe a little bit bad on the redundancy side, but it's going to keep happening unless they start looking at traditional blocking mechanisms. This is a standard IP throttling, connectivity. So those same rules that apply in sort of traditional hosting solutions, because I think they're closer to a hosting solution than they are an Ethereum or a Bitcoin.
Yeah, one thing I would add, a funny little observation, and I think is that there's some people who I have observed the last couple of years who were big Solana shills who worked at either like Alameda or FTX, who like left and became anons, and they've been like posting all these types of things of the following form, which is a mempool in a user space construction of a blockchain. Like the kernel space is things managed by consensus, and is the mempool kind of this thing where like users have to manage it themselves. And in some sense, that distinction actually is a security risk for blockchains that like people did not consider, especially when they were like shilling like low latency all the time. But I do think there's a really good group of people in the Solana world who are actually working on fee markets and sort of mempool stuff in a way that I think is actually quite interesting, in that they're, because of how many failures they've had, they actually have to make a very different mempool design. Again, maybe I'm, as you pointed out, eternally optimistic, but I do actually feel like there's some kind of cool design that you have to do for a mempool that's like trying to be low latency, but also not inject itself into consensus. So at the end of the day, yes, the system is kind of not really a blockchain in any sort of sense. I mean, the fact that there's no fees does kind of reflect the fact that there's no ability to respond to demand. But it does kind of open up an interesting design space, given that you've already bootstrapped yourself to like this much capital is sitting in this thing. And then you have to add a fee market.
Like after the Yuga Labs thing, the Otherside NFT sales, like Vitalik came out on Twitter and basically said like, look, yes, the contracts have been more optimized, but like this is what's going to happen when there's a lot of demand and not much supply. Like this is how blockchains are supposed to work. Whereas in Solana, it's the exact, to your point, Tarun, it's the exact opposite. It's like, oh, well, Solana is supposed to be the NASDAQ of crypto. And the fact that it can't support 4 million transactions per second is a personal failing that we need to resolve by, switching over to Quick or, just kind of throwing more juice at it and figuring out how to make sure this doesn't happen.
It's not just that. It's not just that. This idea that like the mempool is a user space construction versus a kernel space. So this is sort of like, just if you think about like operating system design, right? Like there's certain things that are controlled by the operating system, certain things that are controlled by the user and their applications, right? And the hard part is, where do you draw the line? Where do you say like this has to be part of the operating system versus this has to be part of like the user's managed state? And I think people did not, especially like from a theoretical lens, like 2 years ago when none of these chains existed, like live, people did not appreciate that distinction is quite important. And the interesting thing about what's happening in Solana is that now there's multiple teams, multiple people working on mempool constructions because it's not part of consensus. So there can be multiple mempool implementations that different people agree on. And that space is going to be extremely interesting because they still want to like achieve this like latency bound while also kind of aggregating their sort of like MEV properties into this mempool. And so we're going to see like I think a bunch of innovation from this failure.
I mean, so going back to the Metaplex Candy Machine fee thing, so they basically added this like fixed fee for transactions that meet certain heuristics, which are likely to be bot transactions. Like basically, if you try to mint before the minting is open, or you do a couple different things, and then they charge you a fixed fee, which is so far charged like 400 something SOL. I think of it maybe a little bit like a country that doesn't have an army and instead like totally federated, and basically every state is required to like implement their own sort of like security practices and bot mitigation techniques. And so it's like, and if you don't, then like maybe validators basically ban transactions that are trying to hit you. And so it's like maybe there's I agree like this is very janky, but like it seems like the Metaplex thing is sort of a step towards every application basically being responsible for their own throughput management by implementing some sort of fee market, which is interesting at the very least.
It seems clearly suboptimal, right? Like that seems like exactly the kind of thing that should be happening at the
I mean that's why countries have armies instead of having every state.
To be fair,
exactly. Yeah.
To be fair, right? If I think about ETH also is the same thing where there's multiple mempools right? There's not actually like a single consolidated like a belief in like a single mempool. First of all, there's the different like obviously Flashbots, there's obviously Eden, but there's also these sort of off-chain dark pools that then get aggregated and submit like Matcha, KeeperDAO, whatever. And like at some level, they're also doing the same thing. It's just that in ETH, they made that a first-class problem. They're like, this is actually an important part of our network. In Solana, they just kind of like said it wasn't a problem because the goal is to acquire users and capital faster, as opposed to like solving this fee market thing. And now they're kind of going backwards. And so the question is there like this like too big to die type of thing in crypto of like ApeCoin and Solana, where like at some scale, no matter what, you're actually going to be just have enough resources to invest in fixing that thing.
Right. I mean, look, if Solana does create a fee market, I think that will solve a lot of these problems, like obviously. And to Tom's point, until they do, applications are incentivized to sort of create their own fee markets, which is awful, but can, in principle can be done, or at least you can emulate some of the properties of a fee market by saying, hey, if demand is going really high, or if you're doing things that are out of step, we're going to charge you more for that. The most obvious striking thing is that like Solana is the only major blockchain that has had this kind of downtime, right? Like 7 hours of downtime. That's like no oracles, no trading, no NFTs. Like, anybody who was doing anything that's remotely mission critical was frozen in time for 7 hours until suddenly things restarted. And then, like the arbitrage happened, the trading happened, the oracles got back to work. Like anybody who's on Solana now has to, like, you can't be like, oh, well, they had that one event, but now like it's going to be cool. Like almost certainly this will happen again at some point, and you will have at least multi-hour downtime within Solana. And it's just such a different mental model for what it means to build on a blockchain than for pretty much any other chain that's in existence today. Even the new emerging layer ones. Like I've not seen any new emerging layer one have this kind of downtime and stability issues that Solana has had.
And I'll just posit that the biggest risk of downtime is not on the ability to trade an NFT. It's not on the ability to do anything with the DEX. Like the biggest risk, in my opinion, is that of liquidations or time-based systems where if you're offline for 6 hours, a system like Compound on Solana suffers the most risk, because if you just turn it on after 8 hours, you might have positions that are uncollateralized or underwater that jeopardize other users, whereas most things just jeopardize yourself. Oh, I can't trade an NFT, I can't DEX trade, whatever. It's just you, right? The systems that pool user funds that take on risk related to users are the ones that have the most exposure to an outage and are most difficult to build on a system that could face an outage.
Not to shill, but there is a October 2021 paper that may have me as an author that does cover this.
That covers what exactly?
If you have a loss of liveness, like what the expected kind of trade-offs between order book exchanges and AMMs are, and these kind of things. So
you can read Tarun's paper after this call. He's going to tweet out the link for everybody.
I look forward to that. Yeah, I mean, look, this kind of stuff obviously does happen in TradFi as well, where like you hit some sort of stop limit, like trading goes too far, you turn off the exchange for a while, turn it back on in a couple hours. But usually this happens during times of high volatility. Now in crypto, naturally they tend to coincide, right? So like Solana was down, I think 10% the day that the outage happened. Ironically, it kind of does maybe end up functioning somewhat similarly, except that the code for these contracts is not designed to like turn off and turn back on and then like reevaluate things. And so maybe that just will have to be baked into Solana at some point, because people just know that, look, we have to expect that like there will be episodes of downtime and liveness loss, in which case we need to have some way for the market to effectively recover, assuming that like at any given moment we could have just turned back on after 6 hours of downtime. So it's interesting. It's surprising too, to Andre's point earlier, that almost every single instance that we've seen on Solana of downtime has been, call it honest mistakes, right? It's been sort of a very genuine, like, hey, I wanted to use this as an NFT. I wanted to go, trade on this platform or whatever. We haven't seen anything like the Shanghai attacks happen to Solana, which is really surprising. I sort of expected to be more adverse, like, somebody takes out a giant short and then decides to like try to go break Solana or just spam it with enormous, massive DDoS energy. But that hasn't happened. It's been all just like, NFT knuckleheads going out and trying to mint stuff before the contracts are open, and that takes down Solana.
For the historians, I do think a long time ago in the Bitcoin network, people did try to like sell Bitcoin and DDoS it and like do all these things. I think there was more layer one gamesmanship like a decade ago that did occur. There have been instances where, other L1s, were 51% attacked, let's say. Like there have been trading activities around layer ones and like attacking them that has occurred in the history of crypto, like many times.
KYC exchange, improved KYC at exchanges has, I think, reduced the ability of someone to get away with such an attack.
Yes, but a decade ago, I think this stuff was more prevalent.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like before 2017, it was way easier to do this. It got much harder from the actual taking the other side, shorting type of thing.
Fair enough. Well, let's hope we didn't give anybody any ideas. Andre, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I'm glad you were able to exonerate yourself. I say, at least for me personally, I don't know about Robert. I know Robert has his own feelings.
I've always liked Andre. I think, there's, some people, don't like him on Twitter, but, you're fine with me, Andre.
Nothing but love.
I really appreciate that, guys. Like for real. But I'm pretty sure I would have said something that dug a new hole for me, and I'll find out about that tomorrow when people go out of their way to try and let me know how I fucked up this time.
Oh, don't worry. We're gonna start it. We're gonna go on immediately. You're gonna go on Twitter and start talking all the horrible stuff that you did on the show. Anyway,
All about context.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you. Thanks for gracing us with your presence, sir. And for everybody else, until next time, thanks for tuning in. See you, everybody.